I was a musician in LA, and to fill in, I did some modeling for different people, and gigs were few and far between there. So I could make, $100 an hour, running around on the beach with some pretty girl and model. It was a lot better than washing cars. And one of the people I worked for was a guy named Dunstan Pereira, who was a famous photographer. And he was from Sri Lanka, Ceylon, and by way of London. That's where he'd been. But he decided that he wanted to get into filmmaking. He'd already worked on some films just doing special effects and visualization, solarization, and stuff like that for special effects. And he got a backer and decided that he was going to make a movie in Sri Lanka. So I was one of the people he had read for it, and he wanted Michael Douglas, but Michael Douglas wanted too much money, so he was stuck with me, I guess. So I went there, flew there, and it was a long, long, long flight. And one of the stewardesses got annoyed with me, and I kept asking her, how much longer is this damn thing going to go on? And she said, next time, why don't you take a boat? But we got there, and I was tired. It was a long flight. And I went to the airport building. It was still a pretty primitive airport. And I was in line with everybody going through customs and luggage and all that. And this young Sri Lankan guy, very wiry, thin guy, came up with a sign, my name on it. So I said, here I am. And he came and dragged me out of the line and took my passport, all my ID and everything, and just pulled me up to the counter, and all these people that had been waiting in line were, darting arrows at us. He just ignored them and went up and showed the guy my passport and my visa. He stamped them. Said, go on. The guy was obviously someone he knew or who had, greased the pump a little bit. Wouldn't be surprised, because it turned out that this guy was our fixer for the film company. There are always people that go around to iron out problems, especially when you're in new territory or overseas. So he was our dog robber. So he took me out. We got in the Jeep. And they put me in the back, and he and the driver were up in the front seats, and he was turned around the whole time, jabbering at me. We went through Colombo, and it was maybe 9 o'clock at night, as I remember. And we were in this chaotic mix of vehicles. Lots of bicycles, Jeeps, I think I saw a tractor. There were even ox carts, things like that. I think I saw an elephant with chains pulling some stuff. They're pretty much the living tractors or bulldozers of that part of the world, you know. So we got through it, went to Colombo 5, which is the Beverly Hills or River Oaks of Colombo. And there was a big, imposing house, a lot of cars there. And he said, they're having a party for you. Well, I was a little amazed at that because I wasn't, you know, Rock Hudson or anybody. But we go in, and Mike calls down from the top of the stairs, which was, I think, 3 flights up. It's a big house. And said, "Come on up here." So I went up, and he said something that I thought was so strange. He said, "You're all right. We had you checked out at the airport." So I didn't know who had checked me out, what they were checking me out for, or if it made any sense at all. But I went in, and he lived in this very large bedroom, like big enough to be 3 bedrooms. And his very large bed, largest I'd ever seen then. And so he says, "Come on out here." And there was a little terrace or balcony kind of thing that went over like a different section of the house. And I remember, I think, seeing off to the side that there were these people visiting down below and drinking gin and tonic, and we were up there by ourselves. And he said, "Assume the lotus position." Well, I'd done a little yoga, but I couldn't assume the lotus. So I just crossed my legs. He said, "Envision a white dinner plate 2 feet in front of you." So I tried to do that. I thought this was pretty silly at the time. But boom, somewhere I was in a different state. And it wasn't alarming. It wasn't scary or anything. It was just strange. But I don't really remember any instructions or any explanation. I was just there for a while. And then all of a sudden I was back. And he just smiled at me and said, I think, "Go on to your party." Well, by the time I got down there, everybody was getting ready to leave, but I met a few people. And I had a gin and tonic or 2. I needed one. So then they took me to the headquarters. There was, excuse me, there was an office building in Colombo, and the first floor was offices of the film company, and the second and third floor were bedrooms, rooms for the principals in the film. So I went up there and crashed. And the next day, I heard this god-awful racket, and there was this huge crow on the balcony. Each room had a balcony. And it was only a block away from the ocean, and you could see the sea from up there. So it was kind of a nice place, except there was horrendous traffic. and there was traffic noise. There wasn't any place you'd pick to meditate or anything. But I'd go there and shoo off that bird, and the next morning, I mean, even when I didn't have to shoot, I didn't have to be up, he was there at 6 o'clock. And be caw, caw. And so I tried everything in the world. I tried to scare him off, chase him out there with the broom, and he'd be back, 10 minutes later. It's like he was laughing at me. So I said, the hell with this, and I got some poison, put it in some bird seed, put it on the rail, and when I got up in the morning, I hear this caw, caw, and I went out on the terrace, and here's this poor little sparrow dead on the floor, and the crow is still yelling at me. Well, that did something to me, and I don't know if it had anything to do with Mike at all, although I suspect it might. But then we got about the business of making a movie, which was pretty chaotic since none of us knew what the hell we were doing. We should have had Mike on the movie because Dunstan had ideas and he didn't quite know where to go with them. So we had a lot of hard times, a lot of disagreements. He would do crazy things. Like we'd have footage on the leading lady, and I was also working on the screenplay, so it was doubly traumatic because he would get mad at the leading lady's manager and fire her right then, and then we were supposed to start over. And I'd have to try to write her out, write someone else in. It was ridiculous. So anyway, tension grew, and it wound up, I didn't want to be that close anymore, and I was complaining about it to Michael when I was over visiting, and he said, stay here. And they had a lot of rooms. They gave me this room with an outdoor entrance, plenty of privacy. And I stayed there a good while. I was in Sri Lanka. And they were the sweetest people. I mean, not just sweet, not just nice, but soulful is the only way I can describe it. And bright and interesting. Knew a lot about the world. And they were kind of celebrities there. I think Liz had been an actress too. And there were major local stars that showed up there all the time. I got to know some of them. But it was not a good movie. I learned a lot of things not to do. And in the end, I only got half of the money I was supposed to get for it. But I was always been grateful that I went, that I did it.
Will you tell the story again of your encounters with Mike? I apologize for dragging you through this again.
No, that's fine. Yeah, those two that I mentioned?
Yes.
Okay.
And how did that circumstance arise, as it were?
Okay. There were all these interesting people that would show up at Mike's. every kind of person you can think of, except they were all extraordinary one way or another. And they were like ambassadors and rock stars and local celebrities and Buddhist priests, the Archbishop, Catholic. I mean, people you would never think would even know the same person. And some of them came from long distances, from Europe or from China or somewhere. And they would go upstairs with Mike, and they'd stay 2 or 3 hours. And then they'd leave, and as far as I know, some of them at least just got back on the plane and went home. So this, of course, intrigued me. Mike always acted. He never explained anything to me. He always acted like I really knew if I just shut up and listened to myself, you know. And kind of in a way I did. Anyway, I still pestered him about it. Like, explain what's going on here. And finally, one day, he said, okay. He says, come on, assume the lotus again, right? Still couldn't do the lotus. But I went up and tried, closed my eyes, like he said. And he said, now just visualize a line of green arrows. Just follow the arrows. So I was all of a sudden in deep space, it seemed like. And all these celestial bodies and infinite darkness. And sure enough, here is this path of green arrows just arcing across the universe. And I did follow it. And then very rapidly, I seemed to be in this study or library, very rich, lots of leather, many, many books. And it was in Chile, of all places. And this man was sitting behind this old ornate antique desk. And he said, I know this is alarming, that you're not used to things like this, but you'll get used to it. I'm Dr. So-and-so, and he didn't specify, but I wasn't sure if he was a PhD in something or a medical doctor, but I got the impression that he was a medical doctor. And I asked him, what are you guys doing? What this is all about? And he says, well, we're just people, we're normal people. This is quite ordinary, actually. But you know that the world is in crisis, which the world always seemed to be in crisis to me. This was way back. And there were lots of things going on in the States and other places. He said, we just try to do what we can. He didn't say how you address something like that. And I don't remember most of the conversation. It was a very different kind of conversation. But then suddenly, I was back in front of Michael again. And I knew that there's no point in asking him, who is this guy? What are you all doing to me? Why am I in this crazy place? He would have just smiled. Okay, the other time you're talking about is I'd been there a while. I was living in their house. I came up to talk to him about some book or something. And he said something like, "Help me, Thomas." And I said, "Sure, whatever, anything." So he had me sit down across from him on this giant bed, get into my semi-lotus position. And he said, "Just be aware. Just be here." So I tried to be aware. And then if you remember the old Star Trek series where, people, beam me up, Scotty. They'd go into this little chamber, they'd dissolve and appear somewhere else. So I was sitting there, and that happened to Mike. And he just turned into these electronic particles or something. And then I was sitting there with my mouth open, staring at the wall behind the bed. And I didn't say anything. Nobody said anything to me. And in a few minutes, the opposite happened. And he kind of materialized again in front of me. And he said, "Thank you, Thomas." That was all he ever said about it. So your guess is as good as mine.